Okay, welcome to the 2026 Human Rights Education Review webinar series. Human Rights Education Review, HRER, is an award-winning, peer-reviewed scholarly journal founded in 2018 and currently published by Taylor and Francis. We welcome submissions that address human rights education at all levels of schooling, from early years through to higher education, as well as those that are explicitly exploring human rights concerns within education. And there's a link to the journal in the chat, it should be. This webinar series is hosted in cooperation with the International Association for Human Rights Education, IAHRE, and is the flagship journal of IAHRE. The webinars are based on recently published articles from our journal. We're grateful to the association for its support. IAHRE was established in 2023 and exists to promote human rights education globally, to further research in human rights education, and to enable networking amongst human rights education scholars, as well as cooperation between researchers and others working in the field, such as those working in NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. IAHRE hosts an annual conference, which in 2026 will be held in Münster in Germany from the 26th to the 27th of May. And you can find out more about our activities on the association's website. We also invite those of you who are not members to consider joining or supporting IAHRE. My name is Audrey Osler, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the webinar of the journal and hosting the session this evening. And my colleague Beata Goldschmidt-Gerlo is also an editor of the journal and will be hosting future webinars along with me. So tonight, it's my huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Anna Liddle from Sheffield Hallam University. Anna will be presenting her recent article published in January this year, and it's entitled The Riskiness of Gaza in the Classroom, the experiences of UK teachers during an unfolding human rights crisis. Now, I am aware that this area that Anna is going to talk about is one where we have strong emotions and strong responses. And I'm going to ask you this evening if you will engage with Anna's presentation, or indeed if you've read her article, that you will engage in that, the riskiness of Gaza in the classroom, the experiences of UK teachers, and confine yourself to the discussion of the topic of teaching about this issue rather than the broader issues. And we're very, very happy to have you, Anna. We're delighted to have you. This is the first in our series, and there will be others to follow. The next one is coming up in July, and we'll mention that at the end. But I'm going to hand over to you now, Anna, to introduce yourself and to launch ahead with your talk. And we look forward to hearing it very much. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming. It's great to see so many people coming. I'm looking forward to discussing with you this research more after I've presented it. So as Audrey said, this was published a few weeks ago in the HRER, and it's going to be, so I'm going to be talking through the article a bit and have opportunities to ask me questions later or contribute to the discussion. So the title slide here, just to show you, is a bit of a contrast between the two. So the picture on the right is a photo from the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, and that's a young person sitting in what used to be a school. And then on the left, we've got just a general picture of a British classroom and a teacher talking to some students. So this sort of just shows a bit of a contrast about different areas that we'll be thinking about. And the people on the left will be possibly discussing what's happening on the right, but not always, as we will see. So what's going to happen in this presentation, I've got a QR code there. So if you're wanting to scan to get the article on your phone, I know it's in the chat as well. That's an easier way of getting it for you. But yeah, if you've not read the article and want to, you could scan it on there. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the background to the research project. Also, why I'm framing the war in Gaza as a human rights issue. I'll talk about some findings from the study and also about how a human rights education approach can help teachers cover these issues in a way that may be less scary for them and their students. And then hopefully at the end we've got some time for discussion. So this is the project. So it was this was a survey that ran from mid-May to mid-June 2024. So this was about 6 months after the October the 7th Hamas attack and then the Israeli response. So I've got about 61 people responding to that. And then I did some interviews as well, some semi-structured interviews. So I had 15 teachers and then 3 people who are from organisations that were supporting teachers. So I analysed this using reflective thematic analysis. So those who are not researchers, just to explain that a little bit more, it's looking for themes and so looking at themes in the data to try and paint a picture of what's going on. That point actually doesn't stand. Sorry, I meant in the interview analysis. So in the survey analysis, I've analysed the survey data and that's what I've written up. But I'm still looking at more detail in the interview data. So I've looked at some of it, but there's still more to do. So I'll just first of all talk a little bit about my positionality here. So I've got a background in peace education, so in between finishing university and beginning my PhD. I work for Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, running their education work. Then I'm also got a Jewish background. So I'm not religious or anything, but I do see it as part of my identity. But this is something I didn't disclose to the teachers that I interviewed. So that didn't change the dynamic, but something I reflected on when looking through my data. I've come from the condition that I thought it was really important for Gaza to be discussed in a research context. So something that was going on was really important, and I really wanted to hear teachers' voices around it. I saw things being written in the press, but not actually hearing the voices of teachers. And also I noticed some absences as well. So there's the British Educational Research Association at their conference 2 years ago, it wasn't mentioned, and that caused upset for quite a lot of people. But then with some other people, we did a session last September and had a speaker as well who talks about it. So I'll just explain a bit more about why I'm putting explaining the war on Gaza as a human rights issue. So as I've just realised this was a typo, I'm very sorry. 2026, so the latest figures I could find have been over nearly 72,000 Palestinians have been killed. And I think a particularly important thing to note is we've got over 21,000 of those are children, including 120 since the ceasefire in October. So this is something that's really affected children and is continuing to affect children. And this is something that the UN Commission has, a report from the UN Commission is saying that this is genocide. Schools and hospitals have been targeted. So again, as those of us interested in education, as educators, the fact that education has been targeted is such an important point. So I've got 97% of schools have been damaged or destroyed. So there were most of the 658,000 school-aged children will have limited access to face-to-face learning over the last couple of academic years. So it's also been written about as being scholasticide, the fact that schools and universities have been destroyed, but also things about the sort of destruction of certain kind of sorts of knowledge as well, and certain people's knowledge created in universities. And the other point I'm going to make is, as well as it being a wider human rights issue, it also falls into a human rights issue of what young people and teachers can talk about in the classroom. So I'll just explain some of the overview of the themes before I go into them in more detail. So one of the overwhelming themes was that Gaza was constructed as being risky or controversial by a lot of the teachers. So controversial issues is something that's sort of discussed in literature around when you're looking at political education, human rights, citizenship education. And so it's been described in various ways. And one of the definitions is about when there are significant differences in views within a society. And there's been definitions about looking at things that could have significant differences in opinion. And generally it's something like racism, for example, would not be seen as a controversial issue because there's a clear line there about racism, whereas other political issues seem more of an open issue for debate and discussion. And it was seen as controversial, but it was also seen as very risky by the participants. One other thing that was coming out was teachers and students are both self-silencing on this issue. So teachers, as you will see from some snippets later, they were self-silencing. They were worried about what they could say, what they might say. And some of them were also being silenced. And they also reported that they thought students were not saying what they wanted to say for fear of what would happen. And something I'm really keen to do in the next year or so is to try and hear from some of these students themselves. And another thing that came out was that teachers who used a human rights framework found that quite successful in discussing issues such as Gaza, and they talked about how they'd used it in terms of Gaza. So yeah, one of these key themes is pressure of neutrality. And this is something that I saw had sort of different elements to it. So one element I identified as being a kind of pragmatic element in terms of what they felt that the school wanted them to do. And in the literature, there's been writing about different sorts of avoidance in controversial issues, but I identified this as being directive avoidance because they were told by the senior leadership team. So we've got this quote here. Head teacher and SLT have essentially banned any discussion of the ongoing situation and have only allowed for one short assembly to be shown in tutor time with no follow-up sessions. There's practically a censorship of any discussion. I think censorship there is quite a powerful word that's been used. P16 there it was participant 16. So if you see things like that there, that is what I'm talking about. Other thing was professional. So this is where people worried about their role and identity as of a teacher. And what that meant when it came to when Gaza entered their classrooms. So one said, I find it very difficult not to let my own personal feelings and opinions come out when it is discussed. I'm really not sure how. So you can see this person, they're grappling of what they can do to talk about this, particularly if they have strong feelings about it. And then the third element here, I was thinking, is social. So again, we've got something here. It's incredibly polarizing and can lead to accusations of anti-Semitism or racism against Palestinians. So this was something that quite a lot of them worried about. They were worried about being seen to be anti-Semitic. They're worried about sort of whipping up tensions that may already be in the school or in the community, or being too balanced or being not balanced enough. And this was all going on with them, which they were feeling pressure. And people also, I've got a quote here that I didn't put on the slide, where somebody was seeing the problem with this, the fact that it wasn't being talked about due to this pressure. And someone had said, by refusing to discuss it, schools are tacitly encouraging children to find information online, exposing them to all sorts of content they do not have the maturity to evaluate. So quite a few of them actually talked about social media and how students were turning to social media for their information. And I remember one telling me that a girl came to her crying after class because she'd seen a dead baby on social media and she didn't know how to handle it. And so some teachers were saying that that was an issue, that they should be the sources of information. So this idea around impartiality, one thing that it fits in from a UK context, and the majority of my participants in the survey and the interviews were from England. We had a small number from Scotland, including a couple of the interviewees. But what was of concern to them was there's this legal duty that says that must prohibit the promotion of partisan political views, and that teachers should take steps to ensure a balanced presentation of opposing views on political issues when they're brought to the attention of pupils. So this is something that worries teachers, because really this isn't all that clear about what this means, about what is meant by partisan, what is meant by political in this way. So some teachers were saying they didn't see it as a political issue, for example. They saw it as something that had been politicized. But even though we've got this guidance, it does also say pupils' engagement and interest in political issues should be encouraged. Schools should not prohibit conversation about these issues, provided the political issues are age appropriate. So even though the legal duty part does scare schools and teachers, it is not against the law to discuss issues. But there's some recent guidance that you can look at schools for 2022, I think, and it talks about sort of it includes sort of campaigning groups as well as political parties, and this idea of partisan political views. But there's been guidance given by Association for Citizenship Teaching as well, and saying that it is possible to share views without promoting them, and also your own viewpoint, you don't have to promote it, and you can make sure other views are represented, so the way of putting it, ensure other legitimate views are represented. And also, this doesn't mean everything needs to be given equal airtime either when we're looking at controversial issues. So when we're talking about classroom discussion, keeping on this topic, one thing to consider as well is children's rights under the UN Convention of Rights of the Child. And these were three that particularly jumped out at me. Sharing thoughts freely, freedom of thought and religion, and aims of education. So one thing that made me really sad was that teachers were saying they thought kids were holding back from asking questions, from saying what they thought. And I would say by not giving them that space to do it, without giving them a space to discuss these issues, to find out information, then they're not having their chance to have freedom of expression. So I've got written down some part of the Act. It says the child should have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of the child's choice. So they should be able to express their view unless what they are doing is, so long as other people's rights are respected. And this one as well about their freedom of thought and religion, and also the aims of education. So this is a really important one, that it involves the preparation of the child for responsible life in free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, and so on. So that will give young people the idea of living in a democracy, and that involves finding out about other people's views and learning to understand them. So this was another part of the concerns of teachers, what teachers felt were a barrier. And this was about their own subject knowledge. So I thought this was quite an interesting quote at the top, because I'd put in the survey, do you feel you face any barriers? If so, what are they? No barriers from a point of view, we can discuss anything, but I don't personally think I know enough to make it a fair discussion. So they're saying they can discuss everything, but then it almost seems apart from this, because I don't know enough. And some very similar answers here. Diverse makeup of the students, lack sufficient knowledge to be able to questions that are balanced. I don't understand enough to be fielding questions. So again, this is something where teachers are feeling this is too complex for them to bring into their classroom. So one way that we could think of a way to help teachers and to be able to bring, say, Gaza into the classroom, for example, is through taking a human rights approach. And I've got quotes here from two of my interviewees who have done that. I'll just read them to you because you don't just have to read off the screen, and it brings it to life a little bit. The best angle, I always say, is from the human rights angle. That's where you can't go wrong. You avoid all the politics or whatever, and you just say, this is what's happening, and you just talk from a human rights perspective. And you use human rights organisations and say, this is what they're saying. None of this is my opinion. I think if you do that, that's the easy angle to take, and no one should be objecting to that. And if people do, then actually it comes to asking, why are you objecting to that? And then another interviewee said what she does is to say, look at the people, look at what rights are being broken here, diffuse it from the personal to what role do international governments have, what international law standards and those sort of things. From that point, I can always talk to young people, grounded in, let's look at this from a rights perspective. And it should be noted here that these teachers said that they have done this in the past as well. So they have done this with other situations, which leads me to think this is something that can be valuable for teachers to put into practice. So when something just appears in the classroom, taking them by surprise, that they've got something in place to do that. I also noticed that there were some sort of indirect human rights approaches. So I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about actually using a human rights kind of education framework. But I did note there were some things that could be considered as referring to human rights and care. So we've got one who talked about, well, actually had several who talked about doing fundraising. So despite the fact they weren't saying this is a human rights issue, let's analyse it, they recognised that there were people in need and tried to do something to meet that need and give some agency to the young people. Although I had one of my interviewees tell me, which I found quite shocking, and this will go in when I do write further on this, I'll bring this in, but said that they'd done a Save the Children bake sale for the Gaza Fund from Save the Children, and the head teacher shut it down and said they couldn't do it because could be seen as political, and they could only do it if it went to the general funds and not the Gaza appeal. So I think that says quite a lot about how some schools are reacting. This was another thing that I think showed care, was setting up a support group for those troubled by the conflict. All students had a history lesson, and there was an after-school event that focused on Palestinian culture. And I ended up doing a follow-up interview with this teacher who were explaining about how this was a student-led event as well to understand more about Palestine. So this was, again, empowering some young people. And then also this idea of just acknowledging common humanity. Several teachers talked about how they referred that normal people were being affected, and that could be on different sides, in inverted commas. So this is saying that we are all humans, and these aren't people who are somehow apart from that. So I'll just talk a little bit. Have I got about 5 minutes left? Have I? Yeah. So just talk a little bit about how a human rights lens can actually help with talking about Gaza. So this is something that the UN have used and has been used elsewhere about this idea of education about human rights, education through human rights, and education for human rights. So one way this can be taught through this lens is looking at whose rights are being denied. So we can look at this. I mentioned before the rights of the child. All the articles in the rights of the child are things such as right to food and water, right to education, right to healthcare. And we can see in there whose rights are being denied and what issue this may bring around. And also, this can be a way of looking at other people affected by the war on Gaza, because then if people are wanting to bring in the experiences of people in Israel as well, then we're doing that, looking at it as a human rights issue. Through human rights, we're strengthening democratic skills in the classroom. So to be able to live in democracy, for young people to feel they can participate, understand the world, be global citizens, we're actually looking at issues like this and finding a way to discuss them is also part of a human rights approach. And also it can be for human rights. We can think about how a positive change can be made. And so all of these could thinking about getting young people to be discussing these issues that might be controversial, thinking of alternatives. And for teachers, this can make a shift. So say you look through rights of the child, that can be a way of looking about what's going on, who's being affected. And this is through an international convention rather than coming at it from a particular political point of view. I put political in inverted commas because I think everything is political, but using the sort of language they may be worried about. So just to explain a bit about what I'm still planning to do with this. I'm hoping to write a further paper based on the interview data. So with the interview data, I went into quite a lot more detail with people and pull out some more of the themes from that. Also, I want to find out about young people, what young people think, what they would like to know, any advice that they might have. And so this could be around Gaza, but also I'm quite interested in sort of more of a militarism in general and how young people are feeling about this. And also I'm aware of organisations that have got resources around this, and I'd be quite interested to sort of work with people to inform them about what teachers need and help anything along anything that could be created. Yeah, I think that's it for now. Should I just stop sharing? Is that better?
I think it would be a great idea to stop sharing because then we can see everybody's face.
Yeah.
That would be lovely. And we can invite people if they would to put their cameras back on.